Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on from where you're joining us today. Thank you very much for making the time to be with us. My name is Omar Arias. I'm the manager for the Global Knowledge and Innovation team at the World Bank. And today we are really excited to present two new reports on an issue that I think has been in the minds of many people during this pandemic. It has affected the lives of literally everybody in the globe. With COVID-19, school systems in many countries were forced to literally shut down, in many cases for many months. And because of that, governments were basically rushed to implement measures to provide some kind of learning continuity while schools have been closed. So some form of remote learning, some form of remote instruction. So the questions that are in many people's minds is, has this worked? And what are the lessons from this unprecedented large-scale experience? Lessons for today, because the pandemic is not over, and again, in many systems, schools are still at least partially closed, but also the lessons for the future. And one of the messages from this report, in fact, is that remote learning should be and will be part of the future of learning. So we're excited to present these two reports to you, but we're even more excited that we are going to host a very distinguished panel of speakers whom I will introduce now, but I will say a little bit more when we get to that. So we have Ms. Rukmini Banerjee, the CEO of the Pratham Education Foundation, a very well-known foundation, not just in India, but globally. Welcome, Rukmini. Thank you for being with us. We have Carolina Campos, CEO of Voces da Educação in Brazil. Again, a very well-known and influential organization in Brazil. Welcome, Carolina. Thank you for being with us. We have Fiorella Jaime, the General Manager of Plan Ceibal in Uruguay. Again, a very, very well-known initiative, not just in Uruguay, but it's a brand actually in the world of education technology in the world. So thank you very much, Fiorella, for being with us. We have Bella Ratza Jamil, CEO of Idara e Talim Oagahi. I hope I did that more or less correct. It's the Center for Education and Consciousness, IPA in Pakistan. Again, a very influential organization in the country. Thank you for being with us, Bella. And last but not least, we have Mr. Conrad Saki, who is the chair of the Teaching Service Commission in Sierra Leone, which of course is absolutely central to the efforts there. Not just during the pandemic and what Sierra Leone has been doing to provide some learning continuity, but more generally, the national efforts to improve and accelerate learning. So thank you to all of our panelists. We will get to you shortly. Before that, we will have opening remarks from our Global Director, Jaime Saavedra, who is not able to join us interactively today. He's on mission, probably meeting with the president of Burkina Faso at this time, but he has some pre-recorded message for us to launch this event. Before we do that, let me just remind everybody, we have simultaneous interpretation in 3 languages, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, besides English, of course, and you can find switch to the proper channel that you wish by looking at the right-hand side bottom in your Zoom application. So without further ado, let me just start with our Global Director for some opening remarks.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Many thanks to all of you for joining this event, Remote Learning during COVID-19, Lessons from Today, Principles for Tomorrow. On the occasion of World Children's Day, we are pleased to launch two reports focused on remote learning. Together, they highlight how countries responded, what lessons we as a global community are learning, and what principles we can draw on to lay out a vision for the way forward. I want to warmly welcome the panel of experts we have today from Brazil, India, Pakistan, Uruguay, and Sierra Leone. I am now in mission in Burkina Faso, but I wanted to make sure that I was together with you one way or the other. COVID-19 has disrupted education all over the world and affected the lives of 1.6 billion students. As the pandemic started, most countries saw school closures as part of the arsenal to fight the pandemic. That, as we know, came as a huge cost because nothing replaces presential learning. But during the pandemic, countries did their best to try to compensate. Many countries have been implemented some form of remote learning, often as an emergency response. Some approaches were more high-tech than others, and while the goal was often to reach all students, many countries were not able to do so. However, this shared adversity has accelerated our collective knowledge on how to set up and deliver remote education at scale. These twin reports that we're launching today analyze how this crisis has amplified inequalities and also they document a unique opportunity to reimagine learning as we start to build back more resilient education systems. This pandemic has left several lessons. Let me emphasize this through five that stand out from this research. First, technology for remote learning comes in many forms, from take home paper packets to phone calls to online systems. Yet, the availability of technology is a necessary but not sufficient condition for remote learning to be effective. Effectiveness requires an alignment between technology, teachers, and students. Otherwise, the risk is that technology might end up being an unequalizing factor despite having the potential to be a great equalizer. Second, effective teachers are more critical than ever. To help them deliver, we need to reimagine pre-service and in-service teacher professional development, and we must ensure that they have the tools for implementing an effective digital pedagogy in addition to tools for in-person learning. Only then can they teach effectively in both remote and in-person settings. Third, learning is intensive in human interaction. And the future is actually about balancing technology with the human factor. For remote learning to be successful, it needs meaningful two-way interaction between students and their teachers. At the same time, we cannot forget that the transition to remote learning makes such interactions even more difficult. Even students with access to high tech need high touch, and cognitive support needs to be enriched with emotional support. Fourth, parents are protagonists of the future of their children. It is critical that public policy provides support and guidance to parents and equip them with the tools they will need to support their children. And finally, all countries have a dynamic ecosystem of collaboration for learning. These past 12 months, we've seen ministries of education develop capacities that did not previously exist. We've seen innovative partnerships established and new forms of education delivery deployed at unprecedented scale. We have seen the best of our society when different organizations collaborated to mitigate the negative implications of the pandemic on education. Given what the last 20 months have taught us, where do we go from here? When teachers, students, and technology are well aligned, remote learning has the potential to mitigate long-standing inequalities. We must ensure that remote learning does not devolve into an exercise of more of the same, but with technology. To move forward constructively, we will need a structural change and new capacities within and beyond the education systems to ensure learners have equally effective experiences in person or during remote learning. The last 20 months have revealed a number of possibilities for reimagining how education can be offered and enriched in the years to come. Remote learning remains a key means of ensuring continuity of learning as the school systems return to increased in-person learning and prepare for future closures if they happen. I'm sure that the presentations and panel discussion today will enrich our work and help in our collective mission to ensure learning continuity and accelerate learning. Although the pandemic is far from over, we must seize this opportunity to reimagine education in both ways. Our children and our young people are waiting. Thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to Jaime for those opening remarks, and they are great to actually frame our discussion. Without further ado, we will now go to two of the main authors of these twin reports, who will present the key messages, key findings, and will provide the background for our discussion. So I pass it to Cristobal Cobo, who's a senior education specialist in our global team, and Amer Hassan, a senior economist also in our education global practice. Cristobal and Amer, floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you everybody for joining us today in a very special day. Maybe we can move to the next slide. I think the first thing to say is, as we all know, we are witnessing the largest global school lockdown ever recorded. As painful as it sounds, this crisis, unfortunately, is far from over. Even if we were to declare COVID over, which is sadly is not the case, we know it will have long-term implications. The picture that you see here is a picture from this week in Philippines, which partially opened the first 100 schools. We didn't know any of this thing back in April 2019. So April 2019. But we ever since, we have been collecting data to understand what have been the implications of this global school lockdown. At the beginning, we start collecting information from multilateral organizations, then we start interviewing policymakers, analyzing global reports, then deploying a number of high-frequency monitoring surveys, and then collecting every potential piece of learning assessment that was available. We wanted to know what actions were implemented by countries, how effective were they, to what extent they were benefiting all the students or not. What could we learn of all these disruptions? So a large team of colleagues has been collecting data, and now we are delighted to share some of these results 20 months later. Amer, over to you.
Thank you very much, Cristobal, and thanks to everyone for this opportunity to share some of what we've been finding in the course of our work over the last couple of months. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning, sharing the work of many colleagues who are joined online with us today. One thing that has struck us, I think, as we've been working on these reports is just how different school closures have been across countries. This is true whether we look across regions, this is true whether we look across parts of countries, and it's also true if we look at the same countries over time. On your screen, you'll see sort of a mapping of school closures for three of the World Bank regions: South Asia, Latin America, and East Asia and the Pacific. South Asia, where I work, is one of the regions with the longest school closures. Latin America and the Caribbean is not far behind. Between the two regions, they've had between 429 days closed in South Asia or 387 days closed in Latin America or the Caribbean. And by closed here, we mean either partially closed or fully closed. When you look at what this means in terms of the total available teaching time that was lost, in either region, this is about 75% of the available instruction time that was lost. So with school closures, it meant very different things at the very start of the pandemic. It meant different things in the course of the pandemic, and it means different things now as we're in sort of October 2021, where the tracking data is as current as that. Now, what this has meant is that this great variation in school closures has also meant a great deal of experimentation with remote learning. Cristobal?
Thank you. So next slide, please. One of the questions that we wanted to explore is how looks remote learning in different countries? And by remote learning, we simply understand either synchronous or asynchronous instruction provided outside of the classroom. So we collect a broad of evidence from a broad of different approaches of how remote learning can be implemented, from highly data-intensive systems that can adapt to the learning styles of the learning, all the way to those delivery of printed material packages that can be offered to be accessed at home, enhanced by television, radio, and with all these potential combinations in between with more or less use of mobile phone, for instance. Now, in this analysis of the different experiences, we didn't focus on how advanced was the technology that they were using, but what was the quality of the interaction between the teacher and the student as an essential factor. As Jaime was mentioning, it's not as much on the how high-tech is the remote learning solution, but what is the quality of the high touch that is being provided. So based on these experiences, we learned that the more diversified are the solutions, the higher the flexibility for people to adopt them, and also the higher the levels of inclusion, considering people with different infrastructure will have different opportunities to access one technology or another. Governments, I think they have been incredibly innovative to explore different modalities, and many of these multi-channel delivery options that we see today were completely unthinkable back in 2019 when we think in the scale that we see today. However, I think it's fair to mention that it's unlikely that all these different options of remote learning will produce or generate the same learning experience. Amer, over to you.
Thanks. So when we look at this range of remote learning strategies that Cristobal has just shared with us, three questions kept coming up. The first, was the technology suitable? Second, was the teacher able to effectively use this technology? And third, did this result in an engaged learner? And these three questions have ended up being the organizing framework for the second report, which is trying to see whether these three elements, which we think are critical and complementary, whether they were well aligned in the various examples that we examine in these reports. We find that when these three elements are well aligned is when we have the most possibility for remote learning to be effective. And in the report, we sort of tried to group country experiences into three broad tribes, depending on the level of alignment between teachers, technology, and students. We find that when all three are well aligned, countries could stand to be leaders in the remote learning experience. When two of the three are aligned and not all three, we feel that there are missed opportunities. And then you have a number of countries where you either had the technology or you had the teachers or you had the learners raring to go, but nothing for them to link up with. And so there, I think there are children and groups of society being left behind. So we would like to now turn to some of the examples of exactly what it looks like when these things are aligned or not. Cristobal?
Thank you. So you are talking about alignment, and this is such an important element. And I would like to highlight one example of not ideal alignment, or as you said, missed opportunities. We identify many of the experience that we collected a suboptimal alignment between the supply and demand. Supply meaning the number of resources, learning materials, and channels offered to the student community to access. But at the same time, from the demand perspective, we know that it's not only having access to resources, because access is not the same than use, and use is not the same than learning. And many countries have implemented relying heavily on digital solutions, and in some cases, those digital solutions were unsuitable for the context in which they lack of access, electricity, connectivity, devices, or in some cases, the basic digital skills to use them. So not considering this uneven access could really generate unintended consequences or even amplify existing inequalities. So here is critical to deploy solutions that will fit the specific context. And this is a way to mitigate the negative effects of this element that we call the remote learning paradox. Amer.
Thanks. So the central question that we were grappling with was all of this ultimately effective? And the answer here really depends on where you looked and when you looked, because this is a very dynamic and live situation. Data is pouring in as we speak, some from simulations, some from actual assessments using learning outcomes for children in different grades. And this morning, we're fortunate enough to be joined by colleagues from Brazil, from India, from Pakistan, where very recently these assessments have come to light, and we'll be able to sort of take stock of just how effective were these initiatives in these settings. But I'll give you one example that we have in the report, where we look at a study that came out examining what happened to learning outcomes in the Netherlands after 8 weeks of school closures. This looked at primary school children, and it found that after 8 weeks of school closures, children had learning losses that were the equivalent of a fifth of a school year. So 20% of the school year was lost after 8 weeks of school closures alone. And here we're talking about a well-resourced education system in a well-connected country. So something to think about as data comes online from other settings, what we might see as the evidence builds up. Now, over and above the learning outcomes, there is an element here that we touch on in the report, which we're familiar with this idea of a digital divide. But there are reports that have recently been published, one looking specifically at India, which talks about, even if you're connected, how well you're able to take advantage of that connectivity is the next sort of layer of divide. And they've shown that there's been quite a bit of gap, even among those who have the ability to get connected to the system, about how much they're able to get from the experience. Further, I mean, if we look beyond just how children are doing in terms of their test scores, there have also been reports by our colleagues in UNICEF that examine sort of what is happening in the mental health space for children. Not being able to connect with your teachers, not being able to connect with your fellow students is a very isolating experience. And I think that is taking a toll on children and on their sort of engagement with school, with education. It's something that we, as we think about the next sort of layer of reforms that needs to amplify the effectiveness of remote learning, it's something we have to keep in mind. Mr. Mal?
Thank you. So I would like to illustrate briefly some of examples that I think illustrate well the complexity of these implementations. For instance, in Nigeria and the state of Edo Best at Home deployed before the pandemic a very robust remote learning program that can be accessed through phone or mobile that offer interactive lessons, self-study activity package, digital storybooks that students and teachers were very familiarized with. However, during the pandemic, only 29% of the Edo primary schools had access to this platform. And this is probably because of many of the parents who own the device at home, they need that device to be working those days during the lockdown. Or there were more than one kid at home, so the household didn't have enough infrastructure to access these resources. In the case of Kenya, for instance, with a long-standing institution, the Kenya Institute for Curriculum Development, they offer a number of remote learning solutions. They partner with the national radio and 42 community stations and the global and the government television also for delivering educational materials. However, at the beginning of the pandemic, the use of these learning resources was voluntary. So that really hinders the possibility of having systematic student-teacher interaction, which we know is an essential component. Or the case of Peru. In Peru, it was possible to have regular student-teacher interaction, and the monitoring and evaluation unit tracked that in the first months of the pandemic, 77% of the students received weekly support from parents, from teachers. And the level of satisfaction was fairly high. But on the long run, has been very hard to sustain this engagement on a pandemic that has been extremely long. So as you see, in all these experiences, it's not that there's lack of technology or lack of planning, but the complexity really requires systematic adaptation and monitoring to adjust to the necessities of the community. Amr.
Thanks. So Jaime has alluded to these already, but one thing that we have to keep in mind that this pandemic is not over in many of our countries. Moving forward, the ability to tap into remote learning is going to be critical. So what can we sort of think of as principles for redefining and reimagining what remote learning might look like, given the lessons we've learned in the last 20 months? So one thing we've seen very clearly is technology is available to us in many, many forms. So it shifts the onus to the decision maker of making sure that the technology that is being deployed is fit for purpose. And this purpose could well vary between the urban parts of a country and the rural parts of the country in terms of needing to connect and so on. The second thing that's very clear, and if anybody was ever in any doubt, effective teachers are more critical than ever. We have to use the technology we have available to us to enhance their effectiveness. We need to be able to give them the tools they need to access the technology and to deploy it to enhance their interactions with their students. What the school systems are designed to do is this complex interaction between the teacher, between the students, between the peers, shifting to an electronic platform, shifting to a remote setting. That means we have to make sure that the system is set up to continue those interactions in a meaningful way. Fourth, parents become a very central protagonist in the education space in a way that I think perhaps the whole task of going to school, coming back from school, isolated them from a little bit. We have to engage parents as partners in the teaching and learning process. In many settings where systems were able to get the remote learning packets together to go to the students, parents needed to step in and make sure that that was taking place before it went back out. So we have to have a better system in place for engaging parents. And last but not least, again, Jaime pointed to this, and we have numerous examples in the report. Countries have shown an extreme spirit of collaboration, and we have to rally all actors that are in this space to cooperate for learning as the main focus of our endeavors. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity that you've given us to share the main findings of this report, and invite you to, Iñaki, if you could go to the next slide, please. invite you to download the reports and engage with us in the comments, and we're online at all times. So please feel free to, we'd love to hear your feedback. Cristobal?
Okay, next slide, please. So just before concluding, I want to say that we think that hybrid learning is here to stay. It might evolve into remedial learning, recovery learning, remote tutoring, but it will require structural changes and improvements to effectively deliver education at scale. You will find in this link a wealth of resources that we think can be helpful, and interactive guidance with countries' experiences, well-documented impacts, implementations, podcasts to discuss, and we think and we hope that these materials can be offered. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cristobal and Amer, for that presentation. Very rich indeed. And I want to reiterate the invitation for everybody to download the reports and read them. Hopefully they will be very useful. But now what I would like to do is to move immediately to our panel, our roundtable. Again, these two reports have tried to distill lessons from many countries. The evidence is been limited, particularly the evidence on the effectiveness, direct evidence on effectiveness of remote learning. But the report has tried, the two reports have tried to pencil down with different sources some lessons. What I think will be very useful now is to try to see how those lessons get some texture from the country experiences that are represented in our panel today. The way we will organize the discussion, I will invite the speakers around some of the key themes of the two reports. We will do two rounds of questions. And then when we're done, I will have a very special presentation to you before we then invite questions from you all through the chat. You can start, by the way, posting your questions in the chat already, please, and we will try to do the best we can to bring them into the conversation. But first, let me start with Bella and Conrad. And first, Bella, I want to come to you on this question on the take-up of remote learning. In the case of Pakistan, right after schools closed, Pakistan set up a TV-based remote learning program called Teleschool, which was meant to try to reach as many kids and families as possible. However, there was a survey in Punjab that revealed that about only 30% of families were aware of the remote learning opportunities. So what can you share with us about the lessons from Pakistan's efforts to provide remote learning using television during the pandemic? Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I really want to congratulate the World Bank team for putting out these two reports, and on the eve of the Universal Children's Day, having this conversation, which is so important. With respect to Pakistan, the government was, I think, in a very hyperactive state. Within 2 weeks, we had the government of Punjab, which set up what is called a kind of a homeschool, but on local TV channels. They put out materials, and within 4 weeks, the Ministry of Education at the federal level used the most important television channel for teleschool. In the reports that have been gathered, including the USSR reports, 2 have come out just now. They keep, yes, 30% is what the uptake is. But do remember what 30% means. And this is data gathered about a year after, or 10 months after Teleschool was launched. So when it is 40 million and you have 30% of that, I think that's a very handsome volume that we are speaking about on the uptake. The question is, we have to remember that, we do not have continuous electricity. So even though the televisions may be there at a very high level, but still, when you look at a nuanced disaggregation of households by wealth, the poorest still remain really at a very low level of acquisition when it comes to technology. And that comes again and again in our surveys as well, that we have to look at household wealth. And when we look at quartiles, then we see the uptake's different. So I think the government has been conscious of that, but government has also then gone on after about 6 months after the lockdown, they decided to also start preparing homework packages. So I think it was supplemented by multiple other modes, including, I think, even testing things like tablets in schools and making children familiar. But I think what we come again and again to this whole issue is that whilst there has been this very positive response on distance learning or initiatives where there was, so if you look at what was there before with nothing to this, I think it's very impressive. But what is missing is how do you connect the dots? If, and this is, many studies have been done now, that while you may be connecting with the children in school or the teachers may be saying something to the kids, and this was also your lessons learned, if the parents are not really engaged, they are the most important connector in this period. The gap between schools and homes has narrowed. But if we are not still taking the parents on board, who are, I think, the catalyst now as co-learners with their children, I think this will not really go very far. And the uptake will not be as much as the government may want it. So I think it needs, just as we are reconfiguring distance learning and how that plays an important role in addressing issues of learning, we need to bring on board actors, especially parents or siblings at home, because in our survey says that children said 62% or 63% of the support they got was not just from television, but really from the household members. And I think that is so crucial to factor into the way we are addressing issues of systems of learning. However, the government still remains a bit fixed on making up for academic losses. And you and all of us know who've been in the field and in the trenches that children are suffering from being distressed, depressed, and they need stories and they need social emotional learning options to trigger what would be academic gaps to be addressed. But the government is still not talking much about remedial support, although they're coming around it because we keep on reinforcing that. But they are constantly talking about accelerated learning to make up for the syllabus being squeezed into important chapters, which are always the most difficult ones to cover. And they are not still talking about, a light touch, but a very engaged remedial program, which will also reconfigure the role of the parents with the children and to continue bringing the home and the school closer than what it has been traditionally in Pakistan. So I think the government is onto a good pathway. It needs to find consistent resources. And they have made an announcement that this will continue, the distance learning modality and television. So they're improving their content also. And I'm happy to say, even from an organization like us, they're taking on board about 20 stories, which will be there for grades, for early years up till grade 5 from us, which have been adapted in Urdu and also in Sindhi. But I think those are good things that, at least there's an acceptance of it. But how will it be embedded in systems? How will it change their attitude towards learning and learning for foundational understanding? Because our research from the ASR reports, one launched yesterday for the urban slums, and one launched a month ago exactly on the 16 districts across Pakistan, that they have been learning losses, which are there, and learning losses, actually very steep learning losses for grade 3 children. That may be the lost generation. So it's this kind of stuff that the government really needs to take on board as they continue to dig deeper and invest deeper, hopefully, in the distance learning processes. And I think what you have there presented, as that triangle, of eventually the engaged learner and the effective teacher and the appropriate distance learning modality mix is very important, as well as supporting upgrading of that infrastructure in schools. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, sharing that very rich experience, and great to hear that in fact the government is evolving its plans based on the lessons from the initial efforts. I want to go now to Conrad. So we go to Sierra Leone. In the case of Sierra Leone, there has been already an experience, unfortunately, during the Ebola crisis with implementing a radio program for remote learning. What can you share with us about what made the difference in terms of being able to leverage that experience, and also the lessons that, of course, have now been accumulated with using it and evolving it during the COVID pandemic? Conrad.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on the 2 reports, and thank you for the invite. First of all, let me give some context. Sierra Leone is a small country, but a very young one too. We're close to 8 million people, 46% under the age of 15. Only 2% of households have access to computers, and only 14% to television, but 84% have access to radio. With the Ebola virus epidemic, when the Ebola virus epidemic hit Sierra Leone in 2014, the government implemented a radio teaching program as a mechanism to continue learning during school closures. The radio teaching program was again used in 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic closed schools once again. The Ministry of Basic and Senior Secondary School Education instructed all schools to close by March of 30th, 2020, a week before they were scheduled to close for the Easter holiday break. Just 1 week after schools closed, the ministry revived the radio teaching program as a distance education alternative. The Teaching Service Commission, of which I am a chair, managed the pedagogic functions of the radio teaching program, whilst the ministry's communication unit managed its technical and logistical functions. Naturally, to establish the pedagogy for the radio teaching program during the COVID-19 pandemic, we drew lessons from the radio teaching program which had been implemented during Ebola. So let me just outline some of the stages that we went through. First, we recruited some of the most qualified and successful teachers who taught the radio teaching program during the Ebola epidemic to participate in the design and implementation of the incumbent program. In a 2-day-long pedagogic development workshop, which took place a month before school closed so that materials were ready for the closure, these teachers planned sample lessons and developed scripts that were then reviewed and edited with the Teaching Service Commission's feedback. Second, we held a refresher course for teachers who were delivering the radio teaching lessons, covering lesson delivery and script performance, and developed a life skills program specifically designed to decrease the negative effect of the pandemic over girls' education. The life skill program was accompanied by a strong communication campaign which encouraged males to allow school-age girls in their household and themselves to listen to the life skills program. This was very important to us as we had seen increases in teenage pregnancy and female dropouts after the Ebola period. Third, to increase reach, the radio teaching lessons were aired on the ministry's education radio station and 10 community radio stations. So using partnerships, the government also delivered 25,000 solar and wind-powered radios to remote communities and vulnerable children, particularly girls. In addition to using the radio teaching program for students' distance education, we also innovated by using the radio teaching program to prepare primary school teachers for school reopening. The remote teacher training program reached approximately 4,000 teachers who taught in impoverished schools. The program included radio lessons on how to teach numeracy and literacy and manuals that teachers used to follow along the program. Teacher training program had 2 dedicated lines in the studio where teachers could call in with queries about lessons. As in the radio teaching program for students, listeners also had the opportunity to call personal phone numbers of the radio teaching program instructors to ask questions. My advice to others thinking of doing something similar would be to avoid waiting until the next crisis to reflect on what worked and what didn't work on the current remote learning programs. Take the time now, while radio learning is still fresh, to reflect, learn, and build back better. That way, when the next crisis hits, you don't need to reinvent the wheel, but can improve the existing one to get children further ahead. Thank you.
Thanks to you for those lessons and also very, very wise advice. I think you've already picked up on one of the key messages that we think is important to take away, which is the message of resilience, that we need to make sure that we turn the lessons from this crisis into a system that delivers education in a way that is more resilient to any future pandemic or any future shock. So now I want to go to India and Brazil, and I want to discuss a little bit about teachers. One of the key messages from the report is that in any strategy, and this is, whether it's in person or remote, teachers, of course, are at the center. Without effective teaching, there can be no learning. So, Rukmini, in the case of India, there have been, India, of course, has one of the largest education systems in the world. Close to 400 students are taught daily by around 11 million teachers. It's a monumental task. Many of those teachers are currently working on a hybrid modality as school closures are now partial. From the experience of India, people talk a lot about digital skills, but what are the other capacities and strategies that teachers need to be effective in remote instruction? Over to you.
So thank you so much, Omar, and very interesting discussion. I think we have to remember that distance education is not the same as distant education. In many ways, I think that although the teachers and the children were further away, I think in some cases, especially where teachers were well connected to families, they've become closer. And so apart from content or devices, which I know we've talked about, I think a key point that I think Jaime brought up right in the beginning is that learning is an intensive human interaction, and that this two-way communication is really necessary. So obviously India is a big country. We've been through almost 20 months of school closures. And so there have been phases in which, different state governments have done different things. But I think a common characteristic that has gone through all of this is where teachers and children or parents were able to talk. India has almost 60-70% families with smartphones, but 90% who have a phone. And so I think one of the lowest tech but highest touch is actually being able to call your students every, whatever is the frequency, once a fortnight, once a week, and actually talk to them, I think has worked quite well in places where it has been tried. I think a second thing, and I'm echoing what other people have said, is that this was also a time when you could bring the school closer to the family or the family closer to the school. So we've had states in India who have done, even through the pandemic, large-scale parent-teacher meetings to discuss school opening, to supply learning support, to have parents come meet teachers and take away materials. We've had, for example, in Delhi, where I live, the government put out a full newspaper page saying, if you don't have connectivity, please come to the school and you can take away packages and so on. So I think that this two-way communication established in whatever way was possible has been very useful. I think a third thing in which we see a huge activity among teachers is while in pre-COVID times, you were very dependent on the curriculum and the printed materials that were given to schools, for teachers, like textbooks and worksheets and so on. I think the school closures have brought out quite a lot of creativity on part of teachers. Almost every state reports how teachers have made videos, teachers have shared materials that they have made. So I think that in, kind of centralized systems, this has been a very new and a positive force, is to encourage and highlight teachers who are making their own materials for their own children, but also sharing it with others. Across the board, I would say that we were not prepared for working from remote. I don't think our digital skills were high. I'm not sure that we, even if people had smartphones, I don't think they ever thought they would use it for work. So this last year and a half has been a huge capability increase. And I think many of our governments have used this opportunity to really, encourage teachers to do a lot of their both training, orientation, and, as I said, sharing of materials using digital means. So as a country, I think we would have, if this had been done in a non-COVID time, this digital upgrading of the digital capability of teachers would have taken much longer. But we were forced into it. And at some level, I think this is a real opportunity. But I think as schools are reopening, the situation is becoming more complicated because first you had everybody in school and you had a face-to-face. Then you had nobody in school, and so you were reaching out through whatever means were available. But today, I think as schools are beginning to reopen, you have, depending on the norms that we are putting into place or the protocols, you may have half the class coming today and half the class coming tomorrow. And in the half that comes today, maybe there will be half who are actually attending today and half who are still uncertain. So that one class that the teacher used to teach in face-to-face is now maybe 4 or 5 different kinds of groups, and keeping track of to whom to give how, I think is going to become quite complicated. So we may see a complex phase right now in just organizing teaching learning. Children are also coming back at many different levels. So just going back to the curriculum, as Bela said, will not be appropriate, but how to do teaching at the right level actually with these, some face-to-face and some not to face-to-face is another complication. But I suspect that, teachers who have been very connected to their children will figure out ways and will hopefully share it with others. And those who are having a hard time will learn from it. I think this also calls for looking at what happens above the teacher level. How is this academic support to teaching learning organized? And places where you have that kind of cadre of people who are providing the academic support, who are one step maybe ahead of the teachers, I think the teacher support will be better. Because if there's anything that we've learned, it is that at every phase of this pandemic and school closure, we've had to learn new ways of doing things. And so I think we're entering into a new phase. But through all of this, what we consider as leaders of practice, those who will really support teachers, need to be ahead in the game. And in India, we had a long period where teachers were actually coming to school, but children were not. This was a good time actually to work on this parent engagement a bit, whether it is by going to meet parents or having parents come to meet you or doing it through the phone. I think it was also a very good time to think about how are we going to organize or reorganize academic support on the ground, because that is going to be needed even more than ever before to really, kind of come together to figure out what are the challenges and how, as a group of 20 schools or 15 schools, we can come up with our own solutions, because a lot of these issues will be quite local and we need to come up with how do we support. So in-service training, pre-service training are two kinds of teacher support. But I think the real teacher support that is needed is who can come to my school today and help me with the challenge that I'm facing. And so how do we equip a whole cadre of such people? And that, I think, is not, technology is not the only solution. Again, as Jaime said, that may be a necessary, but I think visiting my own classroom, talking to me, spending time with me in my reality is something that will be, I think, really appreciated at this time.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for sharing that experience. And also, I think you've highlighted a couple of things that I would want to come back to a little later. This whole thing of, meeting children where they are, all the work you've been doing on teaching to the right level. And I think also the very positive view on that, we learn by doing, and systems are doing that during this crisis. So Carolina, in the case of Brazil, there have been a lot of efforts across states, similar to India, to support teachers, a big focus on teachers. However, there was a survey of principals that revealed that around 60% of principals felt that teachers did not receive sufficient training, sufficient support to deliver remote instruction. So from the experience of Brazil, what can you share with us about what should be done? How should governments design training programs, not just now, but actually before our next shock hits us, in order for teachers to be well prepared to deliver remote instruction? Over to you, Carolina.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everyone, and good afternoon. And my congratulations to the researchers from the World Bank for the great reports. It's great to participate in this event. One important thing that was shown in your report is that the remote learning has three components: technology, well-trained teachers, and engaged students. As you said, Brazil has many similarities with India. They are both BRIC countries. But one thing that stands out when we talk about these three aspects is that the teachers have some difficulties or challenges with continuing the continuity of remote learning. We continue with our continuing education. In Brazil, transitioned recently to a new curriculum, ABCC, and it showed that we needed to look better at the training of teachers. That happened before the pandemic in 2017, 2018, but until today, we feel the need to structure better our teacher education. We don't have a national center for the training of teachers. Each state has their own training, and sometimes they work more effectively, in other times not so much. But the pandemic brought to us some very relevant data. In Brazil, it is important to use the structure of data. In Vozes da Educação, we collected several data, and the tertiary sector also has shown that in 2020, 80% of the teachers were not prepared for remote learning. 88% of them had not even dealt with remote learning before the pandemic, and they did not have the training to teach this modality. And this is one part of the this is just the part of the teachers, and we have to also look at the technology and the students. The surveys shown that 70% of the interviewees said that they would like to receive more information about technology so that they could use it in their classes. So when you ask what do the teachers need, the better answer is that we have to train our teachers. It's crucial not only for our teaching, but for other issues. For 2020, we will have a tripod of points to consider. We are going to have to work with remedial teaching and mental health, support to mental health, both including for the educators. In Brazil, we see a lot of school losses, schooling losses in Brazil. For us to be able to teach, we have to teach our teachers and prepare them for assisting with mental health. And school dropout issues are also to be followed up. When Jaime said that the future of education has a human component and has a technological point, these components will make the distance learning function in order for us to boost this development between in the dialogue between students and teachers, but we don't have a very clear concept about this in Brazil. The best response to give you has to do with teacher training, and to think about not only in policies, but to have institutions that can give support to Brazil. We have 200,000 teachers teaching in classrooms, but our schools are still closed, a number of them. Several of the municipal schools are using still remote learning. Many schools are still closed. We have to think of that for the future. Thank you very much.
Acho que eu consegui seguir tudo no Portuguese channel. Sorry, I couldn't avoid practicing my Portuguese. Thank you. Now the question, I move now to Uruguay. Fiorella, in the case of Uruguay, you are not a newcomer. There have been already a lot of investments, lots of experience with the Plan Ceibal before the pandemic using technology, education technology. How did that experience prepare the country to be able to react to the impacts of the pandemic? and what has been unique in terms of the challenges that the country has faced, despite being in a relatively better position compared to other countries. Over to you, Fiorella.
Thank you. Congratulations for the reports. And well, we certainly had a lot of advantages. Every child, every teacher had their own device, their own laptop. But I would especially highlight the fact that we had a considerable number of teachers trained and distributed all over the country that already knew how to use the platforms and the digital resources. So when the schools closed and all teachers had to use these tools, they spontaneously started mentoring their colleagues. And this helped us because it was a very natural and decentralized way to achieve a fast and almost universal teacher training strategy, both for remote and hybrid learning. Now, for us, the model changed significantly with COVID-19 emergency. Previously, our unit, our center was the school, but then suddenly schools were closed. So this also affected our users' pattern of connections, like the connection hours, for instance, and teachers and families expected us to be like a core service, like electricity. And until then, we were just a support service, an optional service. So we had to adapt and innovate in our services very fast, almost overnight, I would say in 3 areas. One, infrastructure. We had to upgrade our servers capacity since the number of different daily users had multiplied by 10. The second one, logistics. Since schools were closed, we had to deliver laptops and we had to devise a different way of doing it. We couldn't gather many people together because of the pandemic. So we developed a scheduling software to deliver laptops for the grades that were supposed to have their new device at the beginning of the year. March is the beginning of the school year in Uruguay. So we were just in the middle of the regular annual laptop delivery and we had to solve that. And the third area implied changing all our programs formulations. For instance, our Se Vale en Inglés program that we used to teach English to every child in primary school. We had to migrate it in a missions-based program, and children had challenges to solve with their families. So in this way, we involved the families in the learning processes and could still get them to learn English. And I would say these are the main aspects I wanted to highlight.
Gracias. Thank you very much for that, Fiorella. Now, what I want to do is maybe pick up on some questions that we already have coming in from our participants. Very good questions. I have to, first of all, apologize because we won't be able to address all of them, unfortunately, given our time restriction. But we will try to cover at least the key themes that are emerging. But before doing that, I said at the beginning that we wanted to share with you something special. And we have a video. I mean, we've been talking about, remote learning. At the center of it all is students, of course. We have a video from one of the winners of a blog competition we sponsored with the Financial Times in the occasion of World Teachers Day last October 5th. Is a student from the Indian public school, Shirin Rajesh. The competition was for kids between 16 and 19, and we asked them to write about the experience, their experience during the pandemic, particularly with remote learning. So let's hear from Shirin.
Learning online is very, very different from learning in person. And first and foremost, we need to be mindful of what's changed in a social situation through the pandemic. Some of us are comfortable with being completely reintroduced into a class with 40 or 50 kids. Other people are a little bit more apprehensive or have concerns, especially where kids are not vaccinated fully, despite going back to school. And I think first and foremost, as I said, being mindful of these apprehensions and concerns is definitely something that I felt would definitely reduce the mental stress and improve the mental health of students. And secondly, as I had identified before, some expectations have not been reduced. Some expectations are still having to be met in terms of the educational requirements of children of all ages. So what our school has done specifically is they've catered to our needs by having a very structured 2 years where we know exactly what we have to do and when we have to do it, so that for one, this stress is eliminated, and number two, we know exactly what the course of our journey through our high school years is exactly. And this structured year definitely helped my classmates and myself because we knew what expectations we had to meet, and all those expectations were met in a timely and a non-stressful manner. And furthermore, our school has also been very active in letting the students have an active role in their education. So we have regular meetings with our teachers where they ask what they can do to help us, or how classes can be changed, or what requirements we need from the class. So I think being mindful of the students' role in their education alongside the teachers is definitely something that I see as a future scope to improving the mental health of students in online situations and returning back to school.
I think it's just refreshing and wonderful to hear from a student, of their own experience in their own worlds, how living through this pandemic and this experience, unique experience, has been for them. I'm going to try now to pick on some of the questions. The team is helping me distill some of them, and I'll come back to our panelists. I won't ask you all to answer the same questions because we won't have enough time. But maybe I will direct some of these questions to you, more or less the way they have been directed in the chat. So I want to go back to you, Bella. There are some questions about parental engagement. It's something you mentioned at the beginning. It's very important not to engage parents in this process. A couple of questions on how parental engagement can be monitored. How can we track whether parents, in fact, are engaging with their kids in remote learning, and what kinds of tools either have been used in the case of Pakistan or could be used for that purpose? Over to you.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. I keep saying two things about the pandemic and the learning situation or opportunities. I say, in spite of all the tragedies, there is what is called, keep calling a COVID dividend. And where I think I keep saying that the subversive has become the mainstream. If the parent was a subversive agent and ignored in the system, the parent has now definitely become the mainstream support partner. The entire approach through this period of the pandemic, and we have had 4 major lockdowns, and the 4 major lockdowns were then interspersed with schools opening at 50%, as Rukmini also shared in India, but also whenever, and the COVID SOPs were, if there was one child sick with COVID, it meant the class shut down for 2 weeks. And if there were more than 2, the schools would shut down. So it's been a very complex affair. And the parents have come front and center. In the work that we've done throughout, we have not had one day where we have not engaged with all the work that we do across Pakistan in remote communities by being able to map not just the households, track down the cell numbers, Of course, the cell usage is very high, even amongst the poorest. And the smartphone take-up has also increased a lot during this period. But the parents have been, for us, also a lifeline. And even for the government, even though the government is not recognizing it. So in our surveys, our tools have changed completely. And those tools which are so household and people friendly, from the citizen-led assessments, those tools are there to take, whether it is phone-based assessments or whether it is possibilities of face-to-face assessments. It's quite easy to get those kind of responses. And can you imagine that even in the early learning work on the ECE that we've done with parents, even the illiterate parents, so-called non-literate parents, they've been most active in play-based learning, including telling stories and working with the children through play. And all of them have been in touch through whether it is SMSs or WhatsApp, or even learning little prompts going to them, or little play sheets or worksheets going to them. So there are multiple ways of engaging with parents, but engaging with parents is critical. We come from a community in South Asia, and I think there are other parts as well, where the school management committees, frankly speaking, have been one of the most fragile and weak governance structures. They're meant to generate the notion of subsidiarity at the local level, but they never do. They were only used for, as parents, as countersigning checks, or how to use the money that comes for the SMC. But here, parents got, and there was always a discussion, parents can't get involved in quality learning. And COVID period has set aside all those myths that parents cannot. Because what we have to share and the data that has come to us is so rich in the way the parents have engaged. And engaged at every level, especially the lower primary, early years, and even primary and beyond, in the sense that they've been wanting to know, okay, what is the strategy of the government? How can we engage? And in some of the work that we've been doing on Safe Schools Reopening, the parents have been, as I said, as the frontline agents. We cannot ignore, and they have learned a lot. The question is, in our cultures, how do we reposition parents as a very critical stakeholder? In the work that I do as a commissioner, and also as Commissioner for Education Commission Asia, where former Minister Joo-ho Lee in South Korea is leading that whole high touch, high tech, but also a spectrumed approach to technology and distance learning, keeps on calling for, and the data keeps coming. The 4-day conference we had in July, that parents really, this high touch is a very important part. Now, high touch can come from stakeholders, including parents, older siblings. Let's not forget older siblings. And in joint family systems, your uncles, aunts, your grandmothers, anyone. So remember our family structures, what they look like, how even in the digital, on the technology side, telephones are being borrowed all the time. Sadly, girls sometimes come right at the end, or wives or whatever. But I think we need to understand the richness of our family structures, the opportunities that they are, and therefore a slightly different way of taking on board the stakeholders that now are definitely forming the new stage of how learning takes place. Now, does that really mean that one of the serendipities of it, or the unintended consequences, positive ones, would be that many parents and older siblings are also learning through those, whether it's through the learning packs, or the teacher coming at home, or an activist coming at home, or even the learning prompts that are coming from SMS. And by the way, the government is also testing on these low-tech possibilities of engaging.
E há também essas
But the government
possibilidades de
really has
engajamento
to
com baixa
take on board
tecnologia,
the
mas
parents,
os
because the parents
pais
are very critical and the
são
extended
realmente
family.
de importância
I'll stop it.
crucial. E fico por aqui.
Thank you very much.
Measurement is not specific.
Muito
I'll be happy to send you the links.
Eu poderei enviar os links
and the
para
questions
todos
that are being asked with very good responses as well.
Perguntas que foram feitas que terão a resposta também.
Thank you. I think I'm getting the Portuguese channel. I'm not sure also in the English, just in case for our translators to check. Thank you, Bella. I want to go to Comrade with, I think, the similar question, but in the case of Sierra Leone, there was this experience of establishing a phone line where actually children and their parents could get in touch and ask questions. It was a way to introduce some form of interaction to complement the radio learning program. What can you share with us in terms of how that has worked to increase parental engagement? Comrade.
Apologies, I've just noticed that my mic was on mute. As you've rightly mentioned, to make the classes interactive, the lessons were included some questions from listeners and also from students in the recording studio. So the lessons lasted for an hour each, 45 minutes of teaching and 15 minutes of questions and answers. Listeners could also call the radio teaching program teachers on a personal phone line to ask any questions. And for some subjects, including French, the lessons were designed to simulate a classroom experience by having 2 or 3 students in the recording studio whilst the teacher presented the lessons. And so through the telephone lines, I think it worked well in the sense that we received quite a lot of calls from both students and parents who reached out to teachers either during the course of the lessons or as a follow-up to those lessons.
Thank you very much, Comrade, and also for the brief response. I'm kind of conscious of time. We're almost 10 minutes from the time we're supposed to end, but I want to make sure that we hear from each of our panelists. And do remember that I will come back to you, sorry about that, with asking you to have a very short phrase, I mean, something we can tweet or put as a soundbite on your key takeaway on the discussion we've had today on remote learning. So start thinking about that to try to make it very sharp. Rukmini, going to you again on this question of which you already mentioned of teaching to the right level. How can technology be utilized effectively for that purpose, whether in person or in a remote instruction setting? How can teachers be supported to use technology for teaching to the right level?
Just to add to, before going to your question, I want to just add to what Bela was saying about parents. I think during the pandemic, particularly in our own work in Pratham, we found that reaching at the right level to parents was almost a precursor to teaching at the right level for children. And I want to just explain what I mean by that. For example, we did a lot of connecting with parents using SMS because that way we knew we could reach a much larger number of parents. So what can you do in 160 characters that actually can communicate engaging activities? And we found that, the more school-like activities we sent, like, what do you call a triangle which has 2 equal sides and one, different side? Parents would say to their children, look it up in the textbook. But if you sent a message which said, how much water did the family use? for washing, for cleaning, for cooking? Can you tell me in buckets? We got a ton of phone calls saying, why buckets? Why not jugs? Why not vessels? Why today? Today was not a good day for water. What about yesterday? So this measurement of engagement, I think a lot of it comes in what kinds of questions come back if you establish a two-way communication. So anyway, that's just to add to the fact that reaching people at the right level, parents, I think is an important one, and we've learned quite a bit on that. For teaching at the right level, I think the first thing to do is how do you figure out what level the child is at? If you can see the child in front of you, especially if children can't read, you can figure that out quite easily by giving some very simple tasks like we do in ASER. But if they're far away, then it's a little bit more complicated, because before you start any kind of inputs to the children, you need to really know what level they're at. And so, we've been also playing with how do you do assessment from remote without it feeling like an assessment? How can you really have a conversation with children? So you can do, like, say, you can often do, a little bit of math through word problems on the phone. So I think critical is how do you do an assessment which doesn't feel like a test, but which feels like you're trying to understand the child. Having done that, what can you send children and how can you follow up the sending with actual conversations again, where you can look at where they're getting stuck and how can they move. We did something quite interesting in the last 2 months before schools opened, where we organized through volunteers small neighborhood level groups of say 8-9 children, and then help the volunteer to do this face-to-face with the children and guided the volunteers from remote. This we did in over 10,000 villages. And what happened was that we also were able through this process to establish one young person in the neighborhood who could be on Zoom, who knew how to look at WhatsApp, who knew what a QR code is, so that that ability close to the children was developed so that this teaching at the right level could happen. When schools open, I think that this could be done in a more structured way of assessing and then following up. But I think that the group structure helps as well. So even if you are going to do this from remote, can you find groups of kids who can work with each other? Because I think kids learn a lot from each other and the social structure helps. Often when you're doing things alone, it seems like a bigger task than when you are together. So I think we have a lot to learn in terms of how do you organize groups. Are heterogeneous groups better for certain things? Homogeneous groups better for other things? There is a teacher, but is there an adult closer to where the kids are who can be kind of the go-between between these? And then often many of our families, like Bela has described, are quite big in your own family, whether you can do some of this within your own family, but having figured out who is at what level within the group. This would be my immediate answer. I think just remember, reaching at the right level can let you do teaching at the right level.
Wonderful. I think you already have your tweet almost there for the end. Thank you. Carolina, just very, very briefly, if you can mention in the case of Brazil, the state of Amazonas also used, for a while has been using a TV learning program to reach remote rural communities. I mean, one of the concerns, of course, during the pandemic with remote learning is the issue of amplifying inequalities. Any quick lesson from how this program in the case of the state of Amazonas has been utilized to make sure that those rural children in rural communities were able to access some form of remote learning?
Thank you very much for your question, Omar. We need to have a good understanding of this program. It was created in 2007, and we have to look at it before and after the pandemic. It was created because the Amazon state, as well as other states in the northern part of Brazil, has a very complex geography. We need to navigate literally, because there are water streams all over the place, and you need to travel for several days in the rivers. It was very difficult to manage schools at medium level, and it was difficult for the teachers to reach the villages. So we felt the need to build up TV studios in the capital, Manaus, where the classes were broadcast. The classes happen in a synchronous manner, but they are relayed by the television to these schools in remote areas. With the pandemic, other states and municipalities tried to create a similar program as a supplement to education programs. So they made partnerships with existing TV stations, or they created studios to try and support students in that way. In the state of São Paulo, the state not only supported the students, but also trained teachers through television. In most cases, there was lack of the necessary structures, but we don't know the number of students that access these programs. We know that it is of high quality, but we do not know how it works for the students. And so that's what I am putting in my tweet. The countries dealt with the pandemic in different ways, but a student is a student, a teacher is a teacher, and a parent is a parent. So what we need to do is to put the human factor at the center of that. So the decisions have to take into account how things will work in practice. We receive this information, this message. So what will be the outcomes? So I think a student and a teacher and a parent is the same all over the world. So the human touch is what is important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolina. I think you have a great start for your tweet, but we'll ask you to do it in 15 seconds. It's going to be a challenge for all of you. But before that, to end with the last question to Fiorella, and I want to ask you the question more again on this issue of inequality, but thinking forward again, given that in the case of Uruguay with Plan Ceibal, there was already a very strong foundation. Any very brief lessons that you can share on what countries should be doing to make sure that remote learning is an equalizer and does not amplify inequalities that already exist?
Yes, well, I would say two things. One thing that we did this year was to bring to Uruguay the video conference system that we have integrated in our LMS. I think this is one of the things that we could have done before, that I would recommend other countries to do, to be prepared and to be prepared to have this remote platform ready for synchronic interactions. The other thing, we have been working on Transmedia Initiatives. We had a novel this year, a Transmedia novel that had chess and computational thinking challenges embedded in the novel. And I would say that having videos and audiovisual materials, it's really very useful in different lines, in different strategies. So I would recommend countries to have contents in different formats ready to be used for teachers. I wish we had more audiovisuals materials when this started. So I think these are my two advices regarding inequity and trying to be ready for this. One of the biggest strategies that we had was to negotiate with all the internet companies in Uruguay so they didn't charge for data traffic when you were accessing your educational platforms. So I think this is very important to ensure that connectivity can be reached from every home.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I mean, we can continue this conversation for way longer, but I suppose people will probably need to drop soon to other meetings. I want to reiterate my thanks to all our distinguished panelists. It's been fantastic to have you. Certainly the experiences from your countries, I'm sure, are drawing a lot of lessons for everybody who connected. I'm not going to try to do summary, concluding remarks. I think, you know, the key messages are clear that, you know, technology needs to be fit for purpose when thinking about using it for remote instruction, that we need to focus on using it to enhance teaching, that we cannot forget that interactions, two-way interactions between teachers and students are at the core of learning, whether in person or remote, that parents are crucial partners, again, something we knew before, but even more crucial during, you know, through remote learning. And then finally, that this is not a task only of the school, that we really need to engage, and with the point you made, for instance, on what Uruguay did and other countries have done to engage the private sector, we need to engage all partners possible in this effort. I'm afraid we have run out of time for our tweets. What I will invite you to do, please, if you can put them in the chat very quickly. The two reports that are available are complementary. I just want to say, you know, one was done actually in the very early stages of the pandemic, and then the second one more recently to try to capture the evidence on the take-up and effectiveness. So I want to thank again all of you for joining and invite you to download the reports. And until next time, merci, obrigado, gracias. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good rest of your
Goodbye.
day.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much.